another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and back with me, as generally always, is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm good. I'm back from vacation, and I feel good. Did you miss me, Jody?
I did.
You did, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure everybody out there in Inside the Recording Studio land missed you as well.
Well, I got nothing funny to say to that. So, but just thanks to George for filling in for me. I do appreciate that. I went back, so now you're stuck with me for a minute. So,
Fantastic. Well, today we have an episode that has come to our attention from a listener who said, "Hey, have you ever talked about this?" And I wrote back and said, "I don't believe we have." So we're doing an episode on how to deal with DI signals. As requested.
Right. We've talked about reamping and things, I think, in the past, but
yes, we have.
Not a straight up DI episode. So let's talk some DI stuff.
All right. Jump in, sir.
I don't think the listener specified what they're trying to DI, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that it's dealing with guitars. I think what we'll do today is we'll talk about guitars, of course, but we're going to go into like 3 different scenarios with that and not just guitar. Off the top, I think we should specify that because it's basically like 2 types of DI that we need to be concerned with as far as like the input signal. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about there's either like a line in that we might have on our interface, and we'll go into why both you and I use that in most scenarios. That's generally for instruments and things that don't need their signal boosted.
Sure.
So if we think about, you might have a synth or a keyboard or something, you don't need to boost that signal. That's hot enough. You could potentially just go into a mixer and you'll be fine. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that we have is, I don't think every interface has this, but it's pretty common. This is like a high Z.
Yes.
Like a high impedance.
Or an instrument input.
Yeah, exactly. Different words for a very similar thing. But these are signals that definitely need to get boosted. So when we're talking about guitars, like the output from an electric guitar, for example, is not a loud one, right? So that needs to be boosted. So that's the other. So we got like the line in, or we got the instrument high Z inputs that we need to choose on our interface.
Right. And just for people's knowledge, high Z, the Z stands for impedance, just in case you didn't know that.
Well, what luck and how fortunate that would be that we just call it high impedance, right?
Right.
Yeah, so that's a little nerd knowledge for you. Why don't we start talking about synths?
Okay.
Because I think that's obviously it's the most straightforward. Mm-hmm. We don't really have to think a lot. Mm-hmm. And obviously we're not talking about controllers now that are going to run into a virtual instrument or something, but actual hardware synth or something that is getting recorded.
And often the hardware synth is either going to have a mono out or multiple outs. Thus, if you're going to go DI out of this, you need to figure out, am I doing this on a singular track and running it out of my 1/4-inch mono, or am I going to go out multiple outputs for stereo, or maybe even more than stereo if a synth is capable of doing it? You need to have multiple inputs on your interface to be able to deal with such things.
Yeah, and I would say the most common thing by far would be just a stereo left and right output, right? So there's not a whole lot of thing to think about as far as like connecting that. It's just you going into your line in or line ins left and right on your interface.
Yep.
Or, it might be called like instrument input or something. And these are generally like selected on your interface or whatever software you have there.
And if it is saying something like instrument or high Z, you could run your synth through the mono output into that. Otherwise, if you are going stereo, I'm going to recommend that you use the line inputs and not the instrument and high Z input.
Yeah, I would definitely go the line in. Now, it depends a little bit on certain interfaces. For example, I used to use Apogee stuff all the time. That was called an instrument input. That would essentially be line level. So you need to confirm with your manual that that's actually what it is.
Right.
But it's not like that the high Z where it sort of automatically boosts the level to what I think is going to be the right thing, right? The only thing there is obviously on a lot of the interfaces we have like an input level thing that we need to adjust here. So I would say it's just to not overcook stuff. I mean, it's the general recording thing, right? Don't overcook your inputs because you'll end up regretting it and your life will be shit for a while. Try to undo that.
In the step of going from the synth to the interface, there really is no need for plugging the synth into something else and then going into the interface, unless there's an idea of you want to use a preamp of some sort and or some sort of effects that you want to record with it. Otherwise, it's just a straight 1/4 inch out of the synth, 1/4 inch into the audio interface.
Yeah, there's no need for any additional boxes. But like you said, that it might be cool if you know what you're going to add, like to go through like a preamp or something if you feel like that adds something that you want to the sound. A little bit of a caution that I would say that if you are uncomfortable dealing with something, let's say that somebody goes, oh, you got to go through this preamp. If you don't know what that's going to add, don't use it.
Right.
There's no need for it. You don't have to like boost the signal. Oh, I'm going through my flux capacitor preamp, right, to get extra mojo out of my keyboard. It's as easy as it gets, just like audio synthing into the interface, and you're good to go.
And then, as I have stated in many an episode, the input level into the audio interface is ideal, in my mind, to be peaking at around minus 18 dB.
You're a little bit more Nazi-esque on that than I am.
Yeah, I know.
But giving yourself like some headroom is good. You don't want to go into the red and you don't want to clip your input because, again, it's really, really, really difficult to try to rectify that. In the digital realm, assuming your synth is not super noisy in its operation, boosting the signal once it's in is not a problem, right? So you can always compensate for, air quote here, too low of a signal, right? But don't go too hot. So what you're saying there, the minus 18, it's probably a good benchmark. I think people have a tendency to want to record hotter than they need to.
Yes, especially in the era that we're in now.
Loud, loud, loud.
That's
I thought
right.
the loudness wars were dead, but I guess not. Everything that you hear is about, again, air quote here, mastering and making stuff as loud as possible.
Sure. Next up, we're going to talk about electric guitars. What are some of the ways that we're going to do this?
I personally think that people make this a lot more difficult than it has to be. Coming from your electric guitar, all you're doing is into your line input, or if you have the choice, you might want to go to like a high Z or guitar input. I don't necessarily use that option, but that's an A side. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is assuming that we're going to use amp sims, right? And that's why you would use a DI most of the cases, right, when you're recording that. It's just watching your input levels. Right now, when you're doing guitar stuff, are you still shooting for that minus 18?
On the DI signal, yes.
Yeah.
I do.
Because there are certain amp sims that actually want a little bit of a hotter signal when it comes to this, right? And they will actually notify that on the interface. So you will have to adjust there a little bit just so that you get a healthy enough signal into the amp. Again here, don't overshoot it, right? You don't want to overcook your input signal. And if you do, your guitar is not going to sound as desired, let's say.
Or it'll change the character of what the amp is known for, is a better way of saying it, I think. If my line level needs more gain after my DI signal before it hits the amp, I will throw some sort of gain plug-in prior to the amp to give it that extra juice that it may or may not need. But it leaves my recording signal for the DI at the -18 that I like to work with.
Yeah, I would generally go a little bit hotter here as well, but you could do, I mean, I'm talking about the input now, right? So I will go a little bit hotter, possibly up to -12. I don't pay that close attention to it, to be honest. I am certainly not tickling the red, you know. I don't want to go in there because that would be ill-advised, let's say. You could go, again, like a gain plugin or something, just as you would on like on a preamp, just to kind of boost the signal going into the amp sim. I tend to not worry about that too much. I just have a healthy enough signal going in. Now, there's one other thing that I like to do, though, on my input, and that is generally to apply a high-pass filter on my interface.
Do say why.
For example, right now on my Apollo, that is a hard set knee at like 75 hertz. It's a relatively gentle slope. I think it's like 12 dB, something like that. So it's not like a hard cut, right? But what that will do is just remove anything like low rumble, or thankfully I don't have a whole lot of like 60 cycle or 50 cycle hum or any of that kind of stuff, right? But if you do have issues with dirty electricity or whatever, it just cleans it up a little bit, and it doesn't really affect the tone in an audible sense, to me anyway. So I like to have that there, and it's just like a little bit of a safety net if there's any additional noise that I don't want to include in it.
I hear you.
Do you use that or no?
I do not use it on the line in for the guitar or the bass. I will usually do that after it's been recorded if it's needed. I think the main reason why is that I don't really have an issue with low-end rumble out of a guitar or a bass.
Sure.
The signal's clean, the electricity is clean. I'm not really having that particular issue.
Yeah, to me, it just feels like a nice little safety cap. Then again, I'm not like you. I'm not tuned down to low A or something. You're doing all that, the 9-string guitars like you do. No, obviously, you don't do that kind of stuff. But if you are, I guess that's something you should bring up, right? If you're doing all these like really low tunings, you should probably leave that off then.
Yeah, it just gives you the whole signal. And then if your chugga-chuggas and your mute chunks and rhythm stuff end up being a little too rumbly, well, it's easy to add a high-pass filter in front of whatever it is you're going to need to do so that the signal cleans itself up if necessary.
Fix it in the mix, man.
That's right.
So, yeah, that's a good point. But now I'm also kind of like going against what I said. People tend to overthink this going in, right? But
as you should, though. You want to get it right at the source as it happens.
Sure. Yeah.
Saves so much time on the back end.
Right. One thing that I want to discourage people to do is thinking about that, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need like a DI box. Because it's simply not necessary in this kind of application. If you're just going to go in and hit an amp sim, there's no need for a DI box.
Depends on how far away from the computer interface you might be, though.
Sure, there is that. If you're dealing with like excessive cable runs and things, right? Like, let's say, for example, like you're going DI on a live show or something, and you have these really long runs because you get to run across the forum stage or whatever. Actually, forum's not around anymore. I'm dating myself here. Then that's one thing, right? Most of us are not dealing with 50-foot cables as we're tracking guitars.
Right. The idea of using a DI box, if it's a very long cable run, in case you don't know as a listener, you plug into it with your 1/4-inch input, and then it converts the signal to the XLR output so that you can do that really long run without adding a ton of noise to your signal. And then on the back end, wherever it's plugging into, it takes that XLR input, and you've got a much cleaner signal without losing a ton of volume and adding a ton of noise. That's the idea of using a DI box. And some studios have their interfaces away from where you might be. And maybe you might need a long cable run because of that. And that would be a special use situation where you might want to use a DI box to get to their XLR matrix in the room or whatever to do your DIing.
This is true. I mean, to bring that up, it's probably a good idea so that if you're going to somebody else's place and you're going to DI and they tell you, yeah, go into the DI box there or whatever, don't assume that this guy or girl doesn't know what they're talking about. They probably know more than you do about their situation. So there's probably a reason for it. But if you're sitting in your bedroom studio, you're not going to need a DI box. You're just going to go straight. No. Right. And it's if you need a DI box at home when you got a cable that's 9 feet, you probably have bigger issues, I think. There's no necessarily sonic benefits of doing that. Right. At least not that I'm aware of, anyway.
What's next?
Well, the other thing would be if we're using pedals and stuff that you want to have in your chain as you're going in. To me, now we're not necessarily DIing anymore in a technical sense. This almost becomes like a hybrid situation, right? If you're doing that, then yes, you're going to need a DI because you need to control all those levels and stuff. Those are probably fewer and far between, and I still claim that we're not necessarily dealing with a DI situation at this point.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
I'm not going to disagree with it.
Oh, well, good. I'm back, and we're not arguing. This is great. No, I mean, once you have your signal in the box, or you've recorded it, now at this point, just think of your signal as you would in the real world, so to speak. If you are going to add like virtual pedals and things, like you kind of alluded to, whether it's a Klon or a Tube Screamer or whatever it is, right? You place that obviously in the same order as you would in the real world before your amp sim and tweak to your heart's content. Yeah. Exactly. To backtrack a little bit on the subject of using pedals on the way in, you should know that everything that you have in your pedal board now is going in the front end of your amp, in this case, the amp sim.
Right.
And that's something that we discussed before. So if you have like a delay or something, it's probably not going to sound that great if you're going through the gain stages of your amp, right?
If you're running it into an amp sim, sure.
Right. That's a whole other situation. Again, and I'll die on that hill saying that that's technically not a DI to me.
All right. Acoustic guitars, sir.
Acoustic guitars, yes. Let's do it. Thoughts, Jody?
Thoughts. Recording direct from acoustic guitars is an entire art and science in and of itself. That's the way I would like to say it going into this. A lot of the times, especially when using piezo pickups or piezo style pickups to get the sound of an acoustic guitar, you're dealing with what generally could be described as ping pong balls slapping on water. And that's not the greatest sound in the world. Once upon a time, Taylor Guitars had created a system called the ES system, and they still have it. But it was the original version of the ES system that they designed with Neve, that when you plugged the guitar in and ran it direct, it sounded lovely. It sounded like a wood box with steel strings on it, and it sounded like an acoustic guitar should sound when you mic it up. And the reason why is that the ES system turned the entire guitar into a technical microphone in and of itself. The problem with the ES system is that the fluid that they were using and the accelerometers that they were using to get the signal to translate into this direct signal, which was not a piezo, had issues where the fluid would eat through the plastic coating and leak out, and then suddenly it would die. They have since updated it, and the newer versions of it are not nearly as beautiful sounding, which is really unfortunate. That being said, I still use the ES system that is built into mine. Most other acoustic guitars do not have this. You've got multiple third-party companies that you can use to put pickups and other types of things into an acoustic guitar to amplify it and run it direct. Doing so, you need to be careful with it, and I would highly suggest using some sort of preamp to soften the blow, so to speak, to give it some color so that it doesn't sound like ping pong balls slapping off water.
That's what we're trying to avoid, right?
Yes.
But let's go back to the beginning of the signal then, right? So let's say that you have a decent built-in preamp system in your acoustic guitar.
Yes.
Let's say that you have a decent preamp system built into your guitar. What input are you going into on your
Line
interface?
in.
Still a line in. I just want to make sure that we don't gloss over that. So we're still going in there and we're adjusting as normal.
I'm not going into the instrument input. I'm not going into the high Z input. I'm going into the line in, which could be tip ring sleeve, 1/4 inch, or XLR. My Taylor is an XLR output. In terms of going from the Taylor, it goes with a tip ring sleeve to an XLR output that goes to whatever interface. And if I'm super ridiculous, I actually have this Neve box that you get from Taylor guitars that can convert the signal, which is a preamp for the acoustic guitar as well, that works in conjunction with the ES system. Not everybody has the ES system. Some people have the LR bags. There's the Fishman stuff. There's all kinds of things that you can get to amplify an acoustic guitar. The idea is using some sort of really nice preamp to help soften that signal, warm it up, and make it not sound, as I've said before, ping pong balls slapping off water.
Yeah, with acoustic guitars, in contrast to electric guitars, we're obviously a lot less likely to be going through an amp sim. Here, I would encourage that where you're talking about the experimentation with whether it's virtual pre's or line boxes or anything, not necessarily a DI box, but something that might add slight compression, so maybe like some tube warmth, air quotes here, right? To experiment in getting as good of a sound or as close to a finished sound as you can on the way in. Mentioned a couple of times today, mentioned like the UA stuff or like the unison preamps and things that you have there. Here, I would encourage that. You don't have to. You can, of course, add all this kind of stuff after you recorded and you tracked everything, which is probably a safer bet if you're not sure exactly what it is that you're doing. The overarching thing here is, like with all of these things, I don't overcook stuff.
Exactly.
If we don't know what we're doing, like, oh, it sounds brilliant if I boost 12K, and then it sounds horrible in the mix or whatever. Same thing with like low end, or get as good a signal as you can, but don't overcook it. But I think there's a little bit more freedom possibly with experimentation when you're dealing with acoustic guitars. In my experience, the preamps that are built into acoustic guitars vary quite drastically, to say the least, between brands and qualities. And some of them sound really good, and a lot of them leave a lot to be desired. So to get away from your ping-pongy water sound, maybe adding a little bit of warmth here is a good idea.
I don't disagree. In that regard, now that we've said everything that we've said, what is your go-to for how you DI? Are you going line level? Are you going instrument in? Are you going high Z? What is your preference?
I tend to not go high Z. And first thing is probably I don't trust it necessarily to adjust the level that it should be. Air quote here, it should be a healthy level. I like to go instrument in and back of my interface, and I like to adjust it. So it's like a line level. And I can have more control over the input that way. That's just something that I like having that control. I know that if something is, let's say I have a different guitar that I'm going in or whatever, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all generally.
Right.
So you might have a higher output on certain guitars, and I'll adjust accordingly. Or conversely, like a lower output on the guitar, you might have to boost it a little bit to get the sound that I want. So that's the way I tend to go about it. What about you? Do you do the same thing?
As I've mentioned already in this episode, I like the line input, and it's very much for the same reason. I never use the high Z input I rarely ever use an instrument input. I like having that input control to keep the volume level at a respectable situation for whatever's at hand. And
Sure.
you don't get that with the high Z or the instrument most of the time. Use case scenario here is that we have a mutual friend that we both know who was using the high Z input, but he wasn't going into the interface's amp sims and couldn't understand why it was getting a little bit too hot.
A little crunchy,
Yes.
a little crispy.
And the reason why is because the high Z input is designed for the amp sims that the interface works with. And he was using a third-party amp sim, and it just wasn't working. And I explained to him, go in via line level, go at this level once you've got it to your level, and then try the amp sim. And sure enough, that fixed everything. So, yippee.
Yeah,
But,
it's just control. Now, one thing that we differ a little bit on our vocabulary here, and I just want to point it out so it doesn't sound like we're talking about two different things here. You mentioned instrument input. I think that is generally just a vocabulary thing on the interface, whether they're talking about a line level or a mic level. Mm-hmm. It's essentially same word as line in. Just that we understand, it's not the compensated high Z thing. Right. It's just the line level. So that we sound like we're talking about the same thing here. But I'm with you there. I like to have that control of the input level. And more often than not, that gives me less headaches and I get the results I want and everybody's happy.
All right. And with that, we'll move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you this week?
I'm a little stunned, and I'm not sure if I should be ashamed or if the company is to blame. You know that for the last 7 months or so, I've been doing a fair bit of work using Isotopes RX. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, there's no other deal in town that does what that does. However, I learned this week that Steinberg, and this is either on Steinberg or me being completely ignorant, not knowing about this product, it's called Spectral Layers. Spectral Layers is up to version 11. So it's probably been around for a minute. It essentially does what RX does. It's a spectral editor with seemingly all the functionality that RX has. Now, I'm well versed in RX now, so I'll keep, working in that. But it's a really interesting alternative, I think. And I know the price point is way lower for the full version than it is in RX. I don't know what that means as far as like functionality, but it seems like a really attractive alternative to that. So Steinberg Spectral Layers 11 is my find for this Friday. What have you got for us, Jody?
As of the recording of this episode, Tidal, the streaming service, is going to be adding Atmos and FLAC playback capabilities. They are dropping the MQA format and they're discontinuing the 360RA format for the time being. And then they're dropping the MQA format altogether. So for those who are Tidal streaming service users, you've got some changes coming up ahead.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah. While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for future giveaways. And we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this amazing podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the letters DI, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Good to talk to you again, Jody. Have a good one. Thanks for listening, everybody.